Hi, I'm Angela Nicholson, and in this tutorial I'm going to take you through some of the fundamentals of adjusting exposure. Let's start by looking at this underexposed image. If we look here on the right hand side at the top, you can see the histogram, which shows the exposure distribution of the pixels. And because they're all predominantly dark, they're bunched to the left hand side, and that's where the peak is. Now if we swap to a more averagely exposed image, just the next one down, you can see that the distribution of the pixels, their brightness, is spread across the entire length of the histogram. Now you can also see that there's a small peak at the very darkest end and another peak at the very brightest end on the right hand side of the histogram. This indicates that we're probably losing some of the brightest highlights as well as some of the shadows, the darker areas, blocking up. Now let's look at an overexposed image and see how the pixel distribution or the brightness distribution shifts to the right hand side, indicating there are a lot more very bright pixels. And you can see on screen there's a big white area that's burnt out. Now let's go back to our middle image and see how we can adjust it to make it look a bit better. I'm using the latest version of Adobe Camera Raw. It's Camera Raw 7 and it comes with Photoshop 6. And the most obvious starting point is to use the exposure slider, and this really governs the exposure of the midtones. If I move to the right, you see that the image becomes brighter and more of the pixels on the histogram move over to the right hand side. You can see there's more and more bright areas appearing. Meanwhile, if I put it back to the left hand side, you can see that the image is getting darker. Now interestingly, you can see that there is actually still some detail in the very brightest parts of the sky here. So we haven't lost all the detail, and this is one of the most powerful aspects of using Camera Raw to adjust the exposure of an image. Now let's use the highlight slider to bring back some of the detail in those highlights. If I just drag it to the left, you'll see that we're pulling out more and more detail in those highlights, but we're not really affecting much of the rest of the image. So if I go back to the starting position, you can see how little detail there is on the left-hand side, but if I put it right over, you'll see that we can see a lot more cloud detail and there's some colour in the sky appearing. Now I want to brighten the shadows, so obviously I'm going to use the shadows slider, and I'm just going to push that over to the right, and that's pulling out some more detail there. Now you can see that the image has lost a bit of contrast. It could do with a bit of a boost. So if I start to slide this contrast control over to the right, you see that we get a bit more contrast. And you'll notice what happens to the histogram. As I slide back to the left, more of the pixels move towards the midpoint. But if I slide towards the right, they spread out across the histogram as we introduce more pixels being closer towards black and white. Now we can also use the whites and blacks sliders to adjust exposure, and the whites is used to set the white point, as the name might suggest, and it basically stretches the brightest tones out towards the very edge of the histogram. So you can use that to create more bright areas if you like, and the blacks conversely works on the shadows and stretches them out towards the left of on the histogram. As well as moving the sliding controls, you can also type numbers into the numeric boxes, like that. And if you're not happy with what you've done, you can always press default to go back to the original starting position, or auto to give a suggested adjustment. As you can see, it's not doing a particularly good job here. As well as making global adjustments to the exposure of an image, you can make specific or targeted adjustments to particular areas within the shot. Now, one of the best ways to make targeted adjustments within Adobe Camera Raw 7 is to use the adjustment brush. You just click on this icon and you'll see that we've got all of these adjustment options that we can apply using the brush. So I'm going to start by making the brush size a little smaller. And now I'm going to brighten the darker parts of the image. And I can just paint that in. Let's put that up a bit more. And you can see it's brightening those areas. I'm doing it fairly crudely at the moment. Now if I want to erase any of those adjustments, I just click on the erase option and then I paint back over where I've made the changes. Another way to delete the work that you've done if you think it's not right is to click clear all. So let's start again with some adjustments. I'm just going to push the exposure up a little bit more, and I'm going to paint in around here, brightening those darker areas. Now what I can do is move the exposure slider to adjust how that looks, and I can just paint it a bit more if I want, or I can paint out some areas, perhaps making the brush a bit smaller, or I can paint it back in again. Just click Add. So you see, you've got quite a lot of control there. Anytime you want to add a new area to work on, just click on New and introduce a new pin. Now I'm going to use this to darken the sky. So I'm just going to paint around. You can see it's bringing out a bit of the colour. And if I want, I can just move that up and down to see what's going on. If I want, I can show mask, click that option, and it will show me the area that's been affected. If I want, I can choose to erase these areas, or I can paint more in. Let's do a bit of work on the foreground. So I'm just going to click Add to introduce a new pin and just paint around here. And I'm going to boost the saturation and boost the contrast. And then you can play around with the exposure. So you see, you can work on very specific areas of the image. Now imagine I want to go back and work on the sky. All I have to do is just click on that pin, and there, I'm back working on the sky now. So I think I'll take the exposure up a little bit to brighten it. Now, as well as using the adjustment brush, you can add a graduated filter, and that has all the same controls. So if I just drag that down, you see I've got just the same controls as I had with the adjustment brush. I can use that to tweak the exposure, the brightness and the contrast, and indeed the saturation, and I can just change the position of the graduated filter, or indeed add other ones. So you see, actually you don't really need to go into Photoshop CS6 to actually adjust the exposure of your image. You can often do most of the work in Camera Raw 7.